Welcome to Train Time, a podcast from the Train Campaign. You'll hear from leaders around the country about different passenger rail projects, because we're convinced that passenger rail is the essential framework for efficient, sustainable transportation in the 21st century. Train Time is hosted by Karen Christensen, who founded the Train Campaign.
Pardon me, boys, is that the Chattanooga choo-choo?
Support for Train Time is provided by the Transportation for Massachusetts Coalition, which includes more than 100 organizations advocating for clean, equitable, smart transportation solutions. From sidewalks and bike lanes to intercity rail, T4MA is leading the conversation on how we can build a truly modern transportation system. Learn more at t4ma.org. Good morning, I'm Karen Christensen, host of Train Time and founder of the Train Campaign. Today I have the great pleasure of talking to two of the people who so successfully revived train service between Boston and Maine. Wayne Davis and Bruce Sleeper will be telling us how that service, the Downeaster, became a model and a beacon to rail advocates across the United States. Wayne and I, before we started, we're talking about how awful it is to have to drive. We are definitely people who prefer to take the train if we can. But you two have been at this for really quite a long time with notable, really very well known and very important results for your state and our region. So I am dying, as I know our listeners are, to hear how you did it. How did you get started in restoring train service to Maine?
I think the first thing and the easiest way to start is to say we've been doing this since the last century. Train Riders was formed in 1989, and I was not involved in the initial formation. I joined a little bit after that, but so Wayne can speak about how it was originally formed, because that's an interesting story in and of itself. But it's 1989 to 2021 is a long time.
It's a long time.
My kids were being born back then, and at this point, my youngest turns 30 in a week.
So they've grown up with trains. Well, Wayne, since you were there from the very beginning, tell us what about the gestation, the birth of this effort?
Well, the birth was my background was in banking. And at that point, I was CEO of a mortgage company. And one of my little stock pieces was, if you're a two-family, you live somewhere where you need two automobiles. If you could get rid of one of them, you might be able to afford a mortgage. But when you were calculating the eligibility, if you need the two cars, you might not be able to have the home. You have to make a choice. So you should pick a house that's somewhere near public transportation, like a train station. So I did enjoy trains, but I've been on them for 30 years. But my job as president of the Mortgage Bankers Association was to go to DC periodically in New York. And I used to fly, but I had one of those inevitable bad trips on People's Airline. I don't know whether or not you ever remember them.
I think I've heard of it.
That was the first of the cut, right? No chairs in the waiting room. You sit on your suitcase. Very simple airline. And when we landed in New York, we blew out a tire, and the train did, the plane did a loop around and round and round until the pilot got it under control, and it scared the hell out of me. So I got to my meeting anyway. When it was time to return, called the office and said, "What am I going to do?" And my secretary said, "Well, why don't you take the train?" My husband and I took the kids to Washington for the flower festival, and it was wonderful. Well, I hadn't been on a train since the 50s when I was in the service. So she made the reservation for me on the train from New York to Boston, and then rented a car for me. So it was a delightful trip. So from that point on, anytime I had to go to the Bankers Association, I would drive to 128 Station and board the train, and take the sleeper overnight to Washington if that's where the meeting was going to be. So I just fell in love with the service. It was so convenient and so civilized. But then I had the inevitable bad trip on the train, and I fired a letter off to Amtrak President Graham Claytor, complaining about the condition of the fairly new Amfleet equipment, burned out reading lights in the coaches, and poor condition of the restrooms on a trip to New York. And after my complaint, I ended the letter with, "Nevertheless, what will we have to do to have you extend Amtrak service to Portland from Boston to save me a trip to Boston in the car?" And lo and behold, Mr. Claytor answered all of his own mail back in those days, and he wrote me a personal letter 10 days later. Apologized for the equipment, shared what he intended to do to correct the problems, thanked me for writing, and suggested that if I was interested in having Amtrak serve Portland, Maine, then I should do a quickie survey of public opinion, and if there was an interest, get back to him. I learned later that Mr. Claytor quite often personally responded to every piece of mail, not just those that interested him. But following his suggestion, I put an ad in the newspaper inviting folks to come to the bank to discuss the issue and enjoy refreshments. 21 people showed up and ultimately became the first board of directors of the group we named Train Riders. And our first activity was to collect public opinions on election day and share the results with Mr. Claytor.
What year was that?
That would have been probably 1987, maybe 1986, 87.
Oh, wow.
Probably 80, closer to 87, wouldn't it be, Bruce? Probably.
Well, you didn't form Train Riders until 89.
1989, but 1988 was a busy time when I look back in my old calendars. That's where the visits with Henry Fern and NARP, and I got to meet Henry, who was then a director of the NARP Board of Directors in Washington. Which gave.
Let's explain to listeners what NARP is. Could you do
explain what? Oh, NARP. I'm sorry, the National Association of Railroad Passengers, and today they still use that, but I think they call the Rail Passenger Association, the RPA.
And that's existed since Amtrak was formed, I believe, in the early 70s.
We were somewhere around late 87 and early 89, because it took me a while to meet all the people and get started on it. But we were blessed with a result that got the attention of Amtrak. And back in those days, I think they were looking for expanded things that might make sense to them. And we told Mr. Claytor, we sent him all the results of the survey, and he said, "Come to DC." So I gathered the Commissioner of Transportation and a couple of the new board members of Train Riders and a consultant we had hired to help us. We went to Washington on the Night Owl and to Union Station. And when we were introducing the Transportation Commissioner and the rest of us to Mr. Claytor in a conference room full of multiple department heads, one of the VPs said, "You're the first officials from any state that we've ever picked up at the station here in Washington. Usually everybody arrives at the airport." Which
That's fabulous.
but he was a peach. Everybody thought Mr. Claytor was a curmudgeon, but he was awfully nice to me. And when we were done with the big meeting with everybody, he called me into his office and he said, "Sit, you want a train? I'll tell you what you got to do to have a train." So he gave me 6 items. He said, one, you got to have the best equipment in the world because you only get one chance at this. So you got to have new equipment. You can't use any junk, worn out trains. So he said, that's my department. I can take care of that, which is where we wound up with $20 million worth of the newest rail equipment that they had. And I kept the memo which said, at no cost to the state of Maine. Try that in today's atmosphere.
Yeah, it's so true. That's one of the questions anyone today is going to ask. Well, how do all these pieces fit together? Who are the necessary participants in having a train service come into existence?
Well, I think we started with the governor and the commissioner because Claytor had mentioned that you got to be on speaking terms with them.
And then because you actually were then wrote legislation, right? And Bruce, is that when you came in?
Well, actually, I came in a little bit before that. And I guess to get back to your question, I think what's important for us has been that it's got to be a grassroots effort. It's got to come from the bottom up. You can try and do it from the top down, but it's far better to start with citizens, get people to sign petitions, talk to their local legislators, go through the local governmental entities, the municipalities, get support there, and keep going up through the state legislature, through the governor's office, through very important, the Commissioner of Transportation's office, and also reach out to the federal government, which includes not just Amtrak, but includes the congressional delegations in the areas that you want to serve, and it can also include the FTA and the FRA, the federal entities that have various grant monies they can distribute. It's become much more of a formal process since we did it, because we were one of the first to do it. We didn't have to go through some of the hoops that now exist, where everybody's trying to get this money for new service.
Yeah, it is. It is complicated now and certainly different, but there's some real similarities. Now, in those early days, did you find that the state officials, once you got near the top, that they were supportive? Did they have to be convinced? What was the situation there?
Well, it depended upon which state official you wanted to talk to. You mentioned a minute ago about the legislation. Well, I did write the legislation that authorized and required what was then the Maine Department of Transportation to take all steps necessary to return passenger rail service to Maine, going down to Boston, which we hadn't had since the 1960s. And so I put that legislation together, but while we were putting it together, we met with the Commissioner of Transportation, who was then Dana Connors, and we had a very interesting meeting with him. He was very, it wasn't like he was going to make it his project, at least immediately, but he was not standing in the way of things. And one of the questions we asked was, we're not sure what we want to put in the legislation for how soon we should have service in Maine, and but we'd like to put in 6 months or something. And he thought about it and said, oh yeah, 6 months is fine. Well, that was probably 1990 when we did that. We didn't get service until 2001, so 6 months was a little slow, short of an estimate. but yeah, we had a choice early on. We could have been an adversary of the government and taken a position that we were trying to force things on them, or we could work with them. We took the latter choice, and it worked amazingly well. It's unless you have a level of government that is dead set against passenger rail service, and that happens, it's so much better, so much easier to work with government officials than to try and force them and coerce them to do what you want them to. Uh, and we were lucky because we were in Maine. People were open-minded at almost all levels of government, and also because in Maine the scale of things is not, as large as it might be. Most public officials are very accessible in the state of Maine. I mean, here.
Actually, that's a good point. I try to provide some background context for listeners who are in other parts of the country or perhaps even other parts of the world. Why don't I ask Wayne to just describe Maine to those who are not familiar with it? Where's this place that you were trying to get train service to?
Well, we still had manners, and still, I think we honored the past. Senior citizens up here were rather revered. I remember from my grandparents' day, if you were senior, you were pretty hot stuff to the younger people. But interestingly, some of the things that Bruce has said really still go back to Graham Claytor, who was not quite my age when we met, but he was in his late 70s, early 80s.
Oh, I guess you better tell listeners how old you are so they know exactly what we're talking about.
A healthy 86 at this point. I don't use walkers or canes or glasses or anything like that.
See, that's what campaigning for train service will do. At least that's what I'm hoping.
I do have snow white hair. I have snow white hair, which wasn't white when I started. But it was Claytor who said, you have to form the relationships with your commissioner of transportation or your secretary of transportation and your governor. And of course, we won on both issues there. And it's always, it was somehow easier to deal with the officials. They were always so polite. When I, halfway through this process, met the administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration, Gil Carmichael, to me, he was like my grandfather. And he welcomed me and he said, come in, you're from Maine. I love Maine. When I went into World War II, we left from Portland's Union Station. Come in and sit down. And I remember his secretary saying, but you've got a room full of people in your conference room. And he said, that's all right. Take them some bottled water and tell them I'll be in 15 minutes. So that, Karen, really just about, I don't know what it was, but the stars and the planets were aligned because it seemed everywhere we went, that's what happened. And it worked well.
And what year did the train service actually, the Downeaster, start running?
It was
2001.
2001. Before a wheel turned, it was 12 years of our effort. But 2001, and then Brunswick was
2012 or 13.
12, yeah, 12 or 13.
So let's talk about the Downeaster, where it runs, what it does, and how the impact it's had.
Well, it's had a tremendous impact, and that was part of our dream as a citizens organization to begin with. It wasn't just to be a toy. It was supposed to be something that would ultimately, in my way of thinking, should be very firmly woven in with the fabric of life in Maine. And I can remember a senator in Washington when I testified before Congress. He said, and what makes you think, sir, that your 19th century technology is going to have any passengers on it? And I smiled and said, well, Senator, the state of Maine has just spent about, many millions of dollars to do ridership studies. And the Federal Railroad Administrator says this is the most sensible project that crossed his desk in about 10 years. So I said, I think we're in place. We think people will ride the train. And again, probably the main thing, our governor then was Angus King, who is now today's U.S. Senator King.
Yes.
And we talked about the train. I dealt with him for the 8 years on a personal level, both he and his wife, who I was involved with school children, educating them about the lovely life you could have if you rode on a train. And but they were responsive and liked it. But the governor worried before the inaugural. He said, maybe you could get some of your board members to be hosts on board the train, because, people can hurt themselves when they're not familiar with train cars. They may reach out to grab the diaphragm or something between cars and lose a finger.
Uh-huh.
And so we did that. So board members acted as volunteer hosts for the inaugurals. And afterwards, the governor said, that was neat. Maybe you should keep that running for the benefit of the public. And that's how our volunteer host program was born, which really set the train apart. The rail authorities, state officials, and everybody were fascinated with the fact that the train had a volunteer host on it, roaming up and down the aisles.
So how does that? Yeah, how does that work? I didn't know about that, and I think it's intriguing. So if I got on the Downeaster from Boston, say next summer I go to Maine on the, what would I see?
Well, we hope the host program will be restored. It was useful for the pandemic,
Yeah.
when the train was suspended for many months. But now our volunteers are back at stations helping people. But Condé Nast did a big article on the Downeaster when it was new, and they referred to it as America's most charming train. Well, okay, we accepted charming, but they would have been able to say fastest or most modern, but we'll take charming, and I think that's what people expect when they board the Downeaster. It's clean. We also are the only train which has its own food service. We don't come from the Amtrak commissary. We have homemades, and we did until the pandemic, of course. The supper train, the 5 o'clock train out of Boston, quite often had homemade lasagna being served in the cafe car. And you could hear people calling home and saying, "Don't wait supper for me, dear. I'm going to eat on the train."
That's how it should be. That sounds wonderful. I can see that no one's mentioned that to me before, but I have so often had, as we talk about, say, east-west or west-east service in Massachusetts, and people have said, well, we've got to look at what the Downeaster does and what the Northern New England Passenger Rail Authority has done. Actually, that's a point that perhaps we should spend a few minutes on. Perhaps, well, either of you could talk about what is the Passenger Rail Authority.
Well, they like to say that they don't run the train, but they make the trains run. They oversee. They are the state authority that oversees the service. They can do more than just the Downeaster, but that's what they're doing right now. And they work with Amtrak as well as the host railroad, which is now Pan Am, may wind up being CSX soon. And they are the ones that set the fares. They set the schedules, within the parameters of what Amtrak can provide. They have a budget as to what it's going to cost and so on. What they were created for, however, was that originally it was going to be the Maine Department of Transportation, our MDOT, that was going to be in that position. There was some concern that there might be some liability directly to the state if that was the case. So the Rail Authority was created, and I worked on the legislation for that as well. And they've been in place ever since before the train started running, and continue to do an excellent job. And Patricia Quinn, their executive director, is a nationally known figure in passenger rail circles, and as a leader among the state-supported service groups. And we've just had a great experience with that. It's not just train riders.
Yeah, I'm hoping to have her
Yeah,
as a guest.
it's not just train riders. We started everything, and we like to think that we help keep it moving. But there's a lot of other bits and pieces here, from Pan Am to Amtrak to NEPRA to the federal government and so forth, that are all working together to make this a success. As Wayne said, we put in some unique touches. The host program is completely volunteer, and we usually we would love to have one host on every single train, but we just don't have enough hosts for that. Plus, there's one train that's pretty late at night. Nobody wants to be bothered. But those hosts, when they're on there, go up and down the aisle and say, does anyone need any help? Do you need any directions? Do you need any, what would you like? And give guidance as well as physical help in some instances to the passengers. They work closely with the crew, because of course the train crew is in charge of everything. But they're almost like assistants to the crew in some instances, limited, but in some instances. And otherwise, they're there for the passengers and just for the passengers.
Now, Bruce, weren't you telling me when we had an earlier conversation that you were giving some train history on a run recently?
Well, that wasn't me. That was Wayne. And
Oh, it was Wayne.
it was Wayne. And we've done that before. There used to be a more of a tourist train that used to go from Brunswick up to Rockland, and Wayne did a little history thing there too. But you should tell that story.
Wayne, when people ask you about the train and the train history, what are their questions?
Well, they want to know, they will board the train. When they board in Boston, quite often I always say, where is home? And where did you come from today? And the people that have arrived by train from Washington or New York or Chicago or California, and they came in on the lakeshore, through the Worcester and Springfield and all of that. And they say, this train is different. Well, how do you mean? Well, look at your heating system on the side. They look so shiny you could toast an English muffin on it. The trains are cleaner. And of course, the crews have to smile. If you don't smile, you're history. When the train was quite new, there was a turnover of conductors periodically, because they were, tended to let, if they were having a bad day, the customers and the passengers were suffering because of it. So now everybody's charmed by the conductors. We've had marriages on board the train where the groom and the bride met on the train as commuters.
Oh, that's marvelous.
So we've had the ceremonies on board, we've had marriages. We have had the conductors know when everybody's birthday is, when somebody gets a job, a new job or an increase. If you're in the cafe car on the 5 o'clock or the 5:30 out of Boston, the cafe car is normally, before the pandemic, was jammed. And it was a party car all the way.
That's the one I'm taking, Wayne. That's the
one I'm
So it's just a happy
One of the things
train.
I think about with this train is that it's not just a happy train. It's like the crew, the passengers, the hosts, whatever. It's almost like a family. And sometimes families are dysfunctional. I don't think we're dysfunctional here. It's a happy family, and it works well together. And I just don't think you have the same atmosphere on many of the other trains that Amtrak runs, and nor do I think you could.
It's something to aspire to. I think this is actually what you're bringing up is really important as we think about what we want in future. I actually, for a final question, I would love to know something about the people who are riding the train. What some of them are presumably there, the summer tourists, summer visitors. Who else is there?
Well, the last figures, before the world came to an end, about 30%, a little over 30% of them were commuters that had jobs in Boston or en route. The rest of them were day-to-day travelers, and it's been that way ever since, except during, let's say, from the 4th of July to Labor Day. That's when we get the people from all over the country and Europe. We were getting an awful lot of people from Asia on the train, and they were all fascinated with the service as being, unique in some way. You couldn't really put your finger upon it, but it was the smiling conductors and the happy hosts and the good food, and on-time performance plays in there once in a while too. When the roadbed is in good shape and your trains are running on time, everybody loves you.
That's right. And that sort of thing really makes a big difference. But I think all these other things that you've brought up are even more important. And I see now more clearly than ever why what you've done is a model. Although I have to admit that I hope it won't take quite as long to get some of the services that I'm working on going.
I do. One of the greatest things, Karen, is that we've had during our history 7 presidents of Amtrak have come to our annual meeting and delivered their greetings. Mm-hmm. And half of those people, as we got into the service, in the 10th year, 11th year, 12th year, they were saying the Downeaster was a perfect example of how local service should be operated. And that's a great compliment.
It's a great compliment. And I have to compliment both of you, but perhaps especially Wayne, because he has seniority, for the terrific efforts you've made and the influence that you are on the rest of us working to bring back the trains in other parts of the country. It's been really a great pleasure to talk to you today. I appreciate it very much, and we'll, I'm sure, meet again before long, but I'm going to be on that train next summer too.
Super. Let me know when that's going to happen. We'll make sure you have a super ride.
All right. That's great. Thank you both Bruce and Wayne, very much, and take care. I'll let you know when the podcast goes live. Support for Train Time is provided by the Transportation for Massachusetts Coalition, which includes more than 100 organizations advocating for clean, equitable, smart transportation solutions. From sidewalks and bike lanes to intercity rail, T4MA is leading the conversation on how we can build a truly modern transportation system. Learn more at t4ma.org.
Thanks for joining us today. The Train Time podcast is brought to you by the Train Campaign, sharing a vision for passenger rail as the essential framework for efficient, sustainable transportation in the 21st century. Learn more at traincampaign.org.